The desert kept its secrets, but some were hung out for all to see. Under a blazing New Mexico sun, a rancher rode into a sight that would change his life forever. A young Apache girl left to die with a sign that read, "White Man's Revenge," from that moment on. Calder Wyatt's world became a battlefield of loyalty and hate, of whispered lies and burning truths. He chose to protect her when every law, every neighbor, and every soldier demanded he turn away. This is the story of a rescue that became a reckoning, and of how love took root in the harshest soil the frontier ever knew. The cry was so faint it might have been the wind. Calder Wyatt reined in his dun mare, the leather creaking in protest. All morning he had been trailing a strayed heifer across the dry flats, the kind of steady, lonesome work he preferred. The sun bore down like a hammer, splitting the air into waves of heat, and dust clung to his shirt, as if it wanted to become part of him. He liked the quiet, liked how the prairie answered only with wind and hawk calls. But this sound didn't belong. It was weaker than any animal, sharper than a branch snapping, more like a breath caught on the edge of death. He turned his head, listening. Nothing. Only the steady tick of sweat sliding down his temple. Then again, the whisper of life where none should have been. Calder nudged the mare toward a draw choked with mesquite. The shadows cooled the air, but not the tension in his chest. At first, he saw nothing, just a sagging freight tree, limbs bare from years of storms. Then he saw the rope. His gut clenched. A girl hung there, limp as a rag, skin the color of red earth and shadowed by grime. Around her neck, the rope bit deep, though someone had tied it loosely, more to mock than to kill outright. A crude plank, hung on twine across her chest. The words burned into it with black tar made his jaw go hard. "White man, don't forgive." For a long moment, Calder didn't move. He had seen enough blood in the war, enough vengeance to know its smell. This was no justice, this was cruelty. And yet, stepping into it meant making an enemy of anyone who had left her here. He could hear their laughter in his mind, already, planning the story they'd spread. Calder Wyatt siding with an Apache. He spat into the dirt. To hell with them! He swung down from the saddle and cut the rope with his knife. The girl crumpled into his arms, lighter than a sack of grain, her, ribs sharp beneath torn cloth. For a heartbeat he thought he was too late. Then her chest shuddered with a fragile breath. "Easy now," he muttered, lowering her gently. "You're not done yet." The mare shifted, ears twitching, as if sensing the weight of this choice. Calder pulled the plank sign free and hurled it into the brush. Whoever nailed those words together had meant to leave her as a warning. Instead, they'd left her to him. He poured a swallow from his canteen, dribbling water across her cracked lips. She flinched, eyes fluttering, dark as storm clouds. No words came, only a rasping sound of pain. Calder didn't press her. He gathered her up, felt how small she was against his chest, and carried her to the horse. Mounting with one arm full, of a half-conscious girl was a fight, but he managed, settling her before him. The mare grunted, then started up the rise. Calder kept his eyes on the horizon, searching for dust that might mean riders, men who would gladly finish what they started. The Yaba ranch lay 2 miles east. A scatter of cedar posts, corral, and low-roofed cabin tucked against the hills. Not much, but it was his. He had built it with his own hands, one nail at a time, and for years it had been enough. Enough to keep him apart. Enough to keep him safe. Now it was about to shelter more than cattle and a solitary man. By the time he rode into the yard, the girl was drifting in and out, her head against his chest. Calder carried her inside, laying her on the narrow bed he'd never shared with anyone. He struck a flame to the stove, set water to boil, and began tearing strips from an old shirt for bandages. When he peeled away the rope marks on her neck, he winced at the rawness. Her arms bore bruises, fresh and ugly. Whoever had done this had not cared if she survived. "You're safe now," he said, though he doubted she understood. Still, the words felt necessary. Through the night he kept watch. He spooned broth between her lips, coaxing her to swallow, and when she gasped awake, he soothed her back into uneasy sleep. He wondered at her age, 16, maybe 17, and at the sheer stubbornness it took for her to cling to life after such cruelty. Toward dawn, when the sky began to pale, she stirred and whispered a word. It was hoarse, shaped like a name, though he couldn't catch it. "What's that?" he asked gently. Her lips formed the sound again. "Lena." Calder repeated it, softly, committing it to memory. Whether truth or disguise, it was something to call her besides a victim. Outside, the prairie stretched endlessly. But for the first time in years, Calder felt the land was too small. He knew the soldiers would come, or townsfolk, or both. A girl left hanging with that kind of sign meant someone wanted her gone and wanted her to stay gone. He sat by the bed, rifle across his knees, and whispered to the shadows. "If they come for you, they'll have to go through me first." And so it began. The rescue that would draw a line between loyalty and hatred, between survival and justice. Calder Wyatt had made his choice, though he knew it would cost him everything. Morning came with silence, too heavy to trust. Calder rose stiffly from the chair where he had kept vigil, his rifle still across his knees. Pale light slipped through the cabin shutters, painting the room in thin grey lines. The girl, Lena, as she had called herself, breathed shallowly beneath the quilt, her face drawn but less ghostly than the night before. He poured water into a tin cup and crouched beside her. "Drink!" Her eyes opened, wary and dark, watching him as if every motion might be a trick. She obeyed, but only barely, swallowing a few drops before pushing his hand away with surprising strength. Calder didn't argue. That look in her eyes said she had learned long ago not to trust what was offered freely. "You're safe here," he said again, though the words sounded thin in the bare cabin. Safety was a fragile thing. A scrape of hoofbeats outside made him turn. His mare nickered low, restless. Calder eased to the window, lifting the shutter just enough to see a ribbon of dust on the trail. 2 riders, blue coats glinted in the rising sun, soldiers from Fort Mesilla. Calder's jaw set hard. Word traveled fast in these parts, faster than the wind. Someone had already whispered about the girl he carried from the drawer. He tightened the rifle in his hands. The knock came heavy, official. "Wyatt!" The coy voice was sharp, carrying authority. "Open up!" Calder swung the door wide before they could demand again. 2 cavalrymen sat astride their mounts, dust on their boots, carbines across their saddles. One, a lieutenant with a hard face, leaned forward. "Word is you picked up an Apache girl yesterday," the officer said flatly. "Is that true?" Calder held his gaze, silent for a long moment. "I brought someone near death into the shelter. That's all you need to know." The lieutenant's mouth curled in something like a sneer. "You know what she's accused of? Knife work on a rancher outside Mesilla, slit his throat clean. We got orders to bring her in." Inside, Calder heard the faint creak of the bed frame. She was awake, listening. He felt her fear pressing against the cabin walls. "She ain't leaving here half dead," Calder said. "You want her alive, you wait. That ain't how orders work." The soldier shifted, hand brushing his carbine. His partner looked uneasy, eyes darting to the doorway as though expecting the girl to appear. Calder stepped out, closing the door behind him. "You'll not drag her like a carcass in your saddle," he said, voice low and steady. "She'll die before you reach the fort, and then you'll have nothing but a corpse to show your colonel. The lieutenant studied him, irritation flashing. But Calder's stance, the war still visible in his shoulders, the quiet certainty in his eyes, was enough. The man spat into the dust. "You've bought yourself a day, Wyatt. Tomorrow we'll be back with papers, and if you stand in the way, then you'll hang with her." They wheeled their mounts and rode off, dust swallowing them. Calder let the silence settle again. His heart beat slow but heavy, each thump a reminder of the choice he had just made. When he stepped back inside, Lena sat upright, the quilt clutched to her chest. "You hear?" he asked gently. Her eyes burned with both fear and defiance. She nodded. Then hoarse, she rasped, "I did not kill." The words were strained, her English broken but clear. Calder believed her instantly, though he knew belief would buy her nothing in court or town gossip. He poured broth into a bowl and handed it to her. She accepted with trembling hands, sipping in small, cautious swallows. "Then you'll have to prove it," he said, though he knew the odds. In these parts, an Apache's word weighed less than a bullet casing. She stared into the bowl, as though searching for strength. After a long pause, she whispered, "My name is Ayanna, not Lena." Calder blinked. He remembered the faint syllables she had muttered in the night, how he had thought them to be Lena. She had let him believe it. Maybe to test his intentions. Now she was correcting him. "Ayanna," he said, rolling the name carefully across his tongue. It fit her. Something resilient, alive. She looked at him, eyes softening for the first in him, as if daring to believe he might not turn her in. Outside, the prairie wind rattled the shutters, carrying with it the promise of trouble. Soldiers would return. Neighbors would whisper. Calder Wyatt had stood alone most of his life, but never with stakes like these. He banked the fire higher, knowing the hours ahead would decide both their fates. The knock of a hammer can carry farther than a gunshot in a quiet town. By late afternoon, Calder had hitched his wagon and set off toward Dust River to fetch supplies. He told himself it was for flour, salt, and medicine, but truth sat heavier. If soldiers were spreading their tale, he needed to know what poison was already in the wind. The town looked the same as always. Sun-baked boards, crooked signs, and horses lined along the hitch rail. But Calder felt the eyes before he heard the whispers. He tied off his team, ignoring the way two men leaned out of the saloon doorway, their voices low but sharp. Inside the general store, Mrs. Hollis greeted him with her usual brittle smile. "Afternoon, Mr. Wyatt." He tipped his hat. "Need bandages, a sack of flour, and that quinine if you've got it." Her hands stilled on the counter. "Quinine?" Her eyes flicked up, sharp as needles. "You tending someone sick?" Calder didn't answer right away. Silence filled the gap, and in that silence, truth made its own shape. Mrs. Hollis pursed. Her lips fetched the supplies and set them down harder than necessary. "That'll be $1.20. He paid, tipped his hat again, and turned to leave. That was when he heard it. Clear enough to cut through the clatter of the store. "They say he brought an Apache girl to his place," a man muttered. "By the pickle barrel. Found her hanging, should have left her swinging," another voice replied, loud enough to carry, "A man that shelters one of them ain't fit to ride among decent folk." Calder kept walking, shoulders square, though every word stuck like burrs. Outside, the air felt heavier, charged. Sheriff Ames was waiting by the hitch rail, thumbs hooked in his vest. He was a man worn hard by years, more politician than peacekeeper, and his eyes narrowed when Calder approached. "Heard a curious tale, Wyatt," Ames said, "about a girl you found." Calder met his gaze. "And?" "And if it's true, you're sheltering a suspect in a killing. That makes you complicit." "She's half dead, Sheriff, could barely lift a cup. You really think she slit a man's throat and rode off laughing? That's for a judge to decide. Not you. Ames shifted his stance, voice dropping low. I'm telling you as a courtesy, this won't sit quietly. Folks lost kin in raids. They'll take matters into their own hands if they think you're hiding one of hers. Calder's jaw worked, but he said nothing. Ames gave a dry smile. Be wise, Wyatt. Hand her over before the storm breaks. He climbed into his saddle and rode off slowly, like a man certain his words would grow teeth by nightfall. Calder loaded his wagon and turned home, the weight of stairs pressing his back all the way out of town. When he reached the cabin, Ayanna was awake, sitting by the hearth with a blanket around her shoulders. She looked up sharply, as if reading the answer on his face before he spoke. They know, he said simply. Her lips pressed thin. She clutched the blanket tighter, voice rough but steady. They want me dead. Calder set the supplies on the table. Then we'll have to see you live long enough to prove 'em wrong. She studied him with that same wary intensity, as though measuring if he truly meant it. Finally, she whispered, Why? You owe me nothing. He paused, pulling off his hat, rubbing dust from the brim. Because no one deserves to be left swinging like that? Because I know what it is to be hated for a name, not a deed. Her brow furrowed. War? He nodded once. Blue coat, long years back, men I called brothers turned on me as soon as the smoke cleared. Some things don't wash off, no matter how you fight. Ayanna's eyes softened, a flicker of understanding passing between them. Two lives scarred in different ways, but bound by the same weight of judgment. Outside the wind rose, rattling the shutters. Calder glanced toward the door, a prickle crawling up his neck. Dust carried voices in these parts, and he reckoned tonight the voices would grow louder, maybe even gather with torches in their fists. He checked his rifle, the sound of the bolt snapping home sharp in the small cabin. We'll be ready, he said. Ayanna lifted her chin, fragile but unbroken. I do not fear death, she whispered. But I fear dying with no one to say, I was more than the sign they hung on me. Calder looked at her then, really looked, and saw not a fugitive, not a burden, but a soul asking to be believed. And in that moment he knew he had already chosen her side, no matter the cost. Night carried the kind of quiet that makes a man reach for his rifle. Calder sat by the fire, shadows clawing the cabin walls. Ayanna lay wrapped in a quilt across the bed, her eyes open though she hadn't spoken for an hour. The wind outside dragged dust across the yard, a sound like footsteps too light to trust. Calder listened, senses sharpened from years on lonely trails. Finally, Ayanna's voice broke the silence. You should let them take me. He turned, firelight catching the hard lines of his face. Not happening. You don't know me. Her words were strained, but steady now, no longer the rasp of a half-dying girl. You don't know what I did! Calder leaned forward, elbows on his knees. Then tell me. For a long time she didn't answer, just stared at the flames. Then slowly she spoke. My father was called Taza, a scout for the army. They promised him land if he carried messages, if he rode against his own people. He believed them. But when the land was taken by ranchers, they called him a liar and left us with nothing. Her voice cracked, the quilt trembling in her grip. My brother tried to fight. They shot him. My mother starved. I learned to cook for soldiers to clean their camp because it was the only way left. She swallowed hard, staring into the dark. A rancher came one night. Drunk. Said he wanted payment. I said no. He struck me, dragged me out. Asterisk. But he was clumsy. He fell on his own knife. The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney. Calder's chest tightened. And they blamed you. Her eyes snapped to his. Would they blame him? A white man. The question hung heavy, the truth of it sharp as broken glass. Calder didn't answer because he knew. He had seen the courts, the way justice bent like wire depending on who held the pliers. Ayanna's hands shook as she pulled the quilt tighter. I ran, but they caught me, tied me to that tree with their words burned into wood. She pressed her lips shut, tears glinting before she forced them back. That's who I am. A girl no one will believe. Calder stood, crossing to the bed. He crouched, close enough that the fire's glow warmed both their faces. I believe you, he said. No hesitation, no doubt. She searched his eyes, as though daring him to lie. When she found none. Her shoulders sagged, the first hint of trust cracking through her fear. You'll hang if you keep me, she whispered. Then we'll hang together, he said, quiet but fierce. For a long moment neither moved. The fire hissed, the wind rattled, and the world outside seemed far away. Inside, something shifted, something deeper than survival. A fragile bond, forged in truth, shared when silence had pressed too heavy to bear. Ayanna looked down, her lips trembling in the faintest ghost of a smile. You're a foolish man. Calder chuckled once, low and rough. Been called worse. A sudden thud outside made them both stiffen. Calder reached for his rifle, motioning her to stay low. He opened the door to the yard, the cold night air cutting like a blade. A stone clattered across the porch, then another. From the darkness, voices rose, low at first, then louder, angrier. Come out, Wyatt! You keeping her in there? We'll smoke you both out if we have to. Torches flickered beyond the fence line, their glow like angry stars against the night. Calder's gut tightened. The storm Sheriff Ames had warned about wasn't waiting until morning. It was here, clawing at his door with fire and fury. He glanced back at Ayanna. She sat upright on the bed, eyes wide but steady, her chin lifted in defiance. Calder shouldered the rifle, voice calm, though his blood thundered. Stay behind me! The night had turned, and with it, so had the story. This was no longer about hiding a wounded girl. This was about standing against the whole weight of hatred that had nailed her to a tree, and Calder Wyatt was ready to pay whatever price that meant. Firelight on angry faces makes men look less like neighbors and more like wolves. Calder stepped onto the porch, rifle steady in his hands. A dozen figures stood at the fence line, their torches throwing shadows that leapt across the yard. Faces, he knew. Men who'd traded cattle with him, shared whiskey in town, mended fence beside him once upon a time. Now their eyes burned with something colder. Sheriff Ames sat on horseback near the front, hat low, jaw set like stone. He raised a hand for quiet. Wyatt, he called, voice carrying over the crackle of torch fire. Don't make this harder than it has to be. Hand her over. Calder's grip tightened on the rifle. She ain't leaving here tonight. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, sharp and ugly. One man spat in the dirt. Another muttered, Traitor! Ames sighed, as though weary from the burden of reason. Listen, Calder, I know you don't want trouble, but that girl's accused of murder. Folks got a right to see justice. Justice? Calder barked. You mean stringing her up before she can even speak? That ain't justice, Ames. That's vengeance dressed up in Sunday clothes. A murmur of unease followed, but anger pressed harder. A man near the front, Sam Doyle, whose brother had died in a skirmish years back, shouted, My kin's blood ain't forgotten! Apache blood's all the same! Ayanna's voice came from inside, hoarse but strong. I did not kill. The yard fell quiet for a breath, every head turning toward the cabin. Calder felt her courage strike through the dark like a blade. Ames straightened in the saddle, tone hardening. Words don't change orders, Wyatt. The fort will come for her by daylight. If you stand in the way, you'll be branded no better than her. Maybe worse. Calder stepped forward, his voice steady, carrying over the flames. "Then you better tell your fort, your colonel, and every soul in this town. They'll have to come through me first." The silence that followed was taut, stretched thin as wire. Faces shifted in the firelight. A few men lowered their eyes, shame creeping in. But others, Doyle chief among them, gripped their rifles tighter. The sheriff let out a long breath. "You've made your choice, Wyatt. Don't say I didn't warn you." He wheeled his horse, and slowly, like shadows peeling back, the mob began to disperse. But not all. Doyle lingered, his torch spitting sparks, his glare promising this wasn't over. When the last of them had gone, Calder lowered his rifle, heart hammering like a blacksmith's anvil. He stepped back inside. Ayanna sat upright, clutching the quilt but unshaken, her eyes fixed on him with something fiercer than fear. "You risk too much," she whispered. Calder shook his head, shutting the door against the night. "No, they risked their souls tonight. I just kept mine." For the first time, Ayanna's face softened. The blanket slipped from her shoulder, revealing a faint scar that trailed across her collarbone. She noticed his gaze and pulled the quilt tighter, but not before speaking. "They left more than rope marks. They wanted me gone from this world. But I am still here." Calder crouched before her, meeting her eyes. "And as long as you're under my roof, you'll stay here, alive. No man's torch, no soldier's order changes that." A quiet settled between them, not empty but charged with something unspoken. Outside, the prairie wind sighed, carrying with it the smell of smoke and threat. Ayanna finally asked, "Why do you fight for me?" Others would not. Calder leaned back, the firelight etching lines across his weathered face. "Because once I needed someone to stand when the world called me less than a man. No one did. I won't make the same mistake twice." Her eyes glistened, though she turned away, quickly, but Calder saw it. He saw the trust beginning to kindle, fragile as the flame on the hearth, but real. He banked the fire higher, knowing the night was far from safe. Somewhere in the dark, Doyle would be nursing his hatred, and soldiers would be saddling horses. At dawn, the walls of this cabin felt thin against all that was coming. Still, as Calder sat back down with his rifle across his knees, he felt something settle in him, a vow, heavier than iron, steadier than stone. Whatever storm came next, he would not let her face it alone. Dawn broke sharp and cold, as if the sky itself expected blood. Calder stood outside the cabin, rifle slung across his shoulder, watching the horizon. The fort's riders would come. He could feel it in his bones, the way a man feels a storm before it crests the hills. Behind him, smoke curled from the cabin chimney. Inside, Ayanna moved quietly, tidying the space as though order might keep fear at bay. By mid-morning, the sound came. Hooves, steady and many. Calder tightened his jaw. Dust rose along the trail, a column of blue coats riding 2 by 2, their sabers flashing like teeth in the sun. At their front rode the same lieutenant from the day before, a leather satchel bouncing at his side. Legal papers, Calder reckoned. "Orders signed and sealed." The column halted at the fence line. The lieutenant raised his voice. "Calder Wyatt! By authority of Fort Mesilla, you're ordered to surrender the Apache girl accused of murder. Fail to comply, and you'll be treated as an accomplice." Calder stepped forward, hands resting on the rifle but not yet raising it. "She's no killer. You'll not drag her away on the word of cowards who left her to die." The officer's eyes narrowed. He drew the satchel, unfurled a paper, and read aloud. "Warrant for custody, signed by Colonel Briggs. Defiance will be punished by imprisonment, or death if you resist." Behind him the soldiers shifted in their saddles, muskets gleaming. The weight of the fort pressed like a wall of steel. The door creaked open. Ayanna stepped onto the porch. The quilt still around her shoulders, her face pale but unyielding. She looked at the line of soldiers and then at Calder, her eyes saying more than words. "Don't do this for me." But Calder's voice cut through the air. "If you want her, you'll have to come through me." The lieutenant's mouth twisted. In irritation, he raised a hand. "Soldiers lowered carbines, muzzles angling at the cabin." Then a shout cracked the tension. "Hold!" From the mesquite brush, another rider appeared. Sheriff Ames, coat flapping, sweat streaking his brow. He rode between Calder and the soldiers, raising both hands. "Wait! Put those barrels down, boys, before you light this prairie up!" The lieutenant scowled. "This doesn't concern you, Sheriff." "Like hell it doesn't," Ames snapped. "This is county soil, and last I checked, no courts heard her case." He turned in the saddle, his voice dropping lower but carrying still. "You drag her out without a trial, you're no better than the mob that tried to torch this place. Last night—" A ripple of unease spread through the soldiers. Some shifted, uncertain. The lieutenant bristled, snapping, "Orders stand! The colonel—" Ames cut him off. "Colonel's not here. I am. You want to fight a war in Wyatt's front yard, fine. But you'll answer to me and every paper from Santa Fe to Washington when word gets out. You ready for that, Lieutenant?" The officer's jaw clenched. For a moment, the air threatened to explode. Calder could almost hear the choice turning in the man's head. Fire or retreat. Finally, with a snarl, the lieutenant jerked the paper back into the satchel. "1 week," he spat. "She'll be brought in, with or without your blessing." He wheeled his horse, signaling the column. Dust rose again, and just like that the storm passed, though only for now. Calder lowered his rifle slowly, the weight of what had nearly happened settling into his bones. Sheriff Ames dismounted, his face grim. "You've got 7 days, Wyatt," he said. "After that I won't be able to hold them off. Decide quick, run or face what's coming." Ayanna's voice came soft but firm. "Running means they will chase. Fighting means they will never stop. Which death do you choose?" Calder looked at her, the firelight from her eyes brighter than any torch. He knew the truth. There was no safe path left, only the one they carved themselves. The sky turned the color of gunmetal when trouble finally came calling. The week Sheriff Ames had bargained passed like a noose tightening. Calder and Ayanna kept to the cabin, every creak of the wind sounding like boots on the porch. Calder worked with a grim steadiness, stacking wood, checking rifles, riding fence lines as though preparing for a siege. Ayanna helped where she could, her strength slowly returning, though shadows lingered in her eyes. By the 7th day, unease hung so thick it felt carved into the air. Calder rose before dawn, saddling his mare for what he knew was coming. When the sun broke over the horizon, he saw them, riders, not soldiers this time, but townsfolk led by Sam Doyle. A dozen men, armed and grim, their horses throwing dust like storm clouds. Ayanna stood at the cabin door, clutching the quilt. Calder touched her shoulder. "Stay inside. Whatever happens, don't step out till I call." She shook her head. "If they come for me, they will see my face, not just their hate." Before he could argue, Doyle and his men reined up in the yard. Doyle's eyes burned hotter than the torch he carried that first night. "Morning, Wyatt," he sneered. "Week's up! Sheriff ain't here to shield you now. Hand her over." Calder stepped forward, rifle across his chest. "She's no killer, Doyle. You know it. What I know is my brother's bones don't rest easy while her kind walks free. You think one dead rancher was all? They're devils in human skin, every one of them." Doyle spat into the dust. "You stand in the way, you'll swing beside her." The crowd stirred, some muttering in agreement, others uneasy. Calder raised his voice. "You all know me. I fought beside some of you in the war, rode the same trails, worked the same herds. You know what kind of man I am." Then prove it, Doyle snapped. Step aside. No, Calder said, steady as iron. Because right is right, even when the world calls it wrong. You want her, you'll have to kill me first. The yard went deathly still, then Doyle raised his rifle. So be it! The crack of gunfire split the morning. Calder dove sideways, firing back. Asterisk splinters burst from the porch post as bullets tore into the cabin. Ayanna ducked low, dragging the quilt across her as a makeshift cover. Calder rolled behind the water trough, returning fire with a precision born of war. 2 men fell back, their horses screaming, dust clouding the air. But Doyle pressed forward, eyes wild. "You can't save her, Wyatt!" he shouted. "You can't save either of you!" Another shot rang out, this one not Calder's. From the cabin doorway, Ayanna stood, a rifle braced against her shoulder, smoke curling from its barrel. A man staggered back, clutching his arm where her bullet struck. For a heartbeat, the mob froze. The sight of the girl they had hunted standing tall, eyes blazing with defiance, cracked through their fury like lightning. "Enough," Calder roared, rising from cover. He leveled his rifle straight at Doyle. "End this now, or you'll be the one buried today." Doyle's finger twitched on the trigger. Sweat slicked his face, hate burning hotter than reason. For a long moment, the world balanced on the edge of his choice. Then a shout broke across the yard. "Stand down!" Sheriff Ames galloped in, deputies at his side, their badges flashing in the harsh sun. He swung down, revolver raised. "Drop it, Doyle! You fire again, you'll hang for murder before sundown." The mob wavered. Some lowered their rifles. Doyle's jaw clenched, his hatred foaming like a rabid dog's. But at last, he spat into the dirt and jerked his horse's reins. "This ain't over, Wyatt. Blood always calls for more blood." He wheeled away, his men trailing, the dust swallowing them as quickly as it had delivered them. Calder lowered his rifle, chest heaving, eyes scanning for any who lingered. The yard fell still, but for the creak of saddle leather and the sheriff's heavy breath. Inside, Ayanna leaned against the doorframe, the rifle still in her hands, her shoulders trembling. Calder crossed to her, taking the weapon gently. Asterisk. Their eyes met, and in that silence, something unbreakable passed between them. They had stood against hate and lived. But the cost was still rising, and the future was a road neither could see. When the dust finally settled, the prairie smelled of smoke and iron. Calder stood in the yard, rifle slack in his hands, his heartbeat still thundering in his ears. The mob was gone. Sheriff Ames had ridden off with his deputies to cool the war. Town's fire and silence crept back across the land. A silence earned the hard way. Ayanna stepped down from the porch slowly, quilt still wrapped around her shoulders. Her face was pale, but her eyes burned steady. She looked at the bullet holes peppered into the cabin walls, at the splintered posts, then back at Calder. "You fought for me," she whispered, almost disbelieving. He shook his head. "No. I fought for what's right." Her gaze softened. "No one ever has before." They walked inside together. Calder stoked the fire higher, not for warmth, but for the sense of life it carried, the symbol of a home that refused to be snuffed out. Ayanna sat by the hearth, hands spread toward the glow, and for the first time since he found her hanging from that tree, Calder saw peace touch her face. In the days that followed, they kept to themselves. Ames came once, grim-faced, telling Calder the fort had backed off. For now. Too much risk, too much scandal if word spread that a girl had been lynched without trial. Calder only nodded. He knew Doyle's hatred still stalked the land like a coyote, waiting for weakness, but for the moment the storm had broken. Ayanna healed. The bruises faded, her steps grew steadier, and sometimes Calder even caught her humming quietly as she worked around the cabin. One morning, he returned from mending fence to find her standing by the river bend, the quilt gone, her hair loose in the wind. She turned, the sun catching her smile, small, tentative, but real. It struck him harder than any bullet ever could. That night by the fire, she touched his hand. "You gave me back my life," she said simply. Calder met her eyes. "No, you kept it yourself. I just stood where others wouldn't." And so the days grew into weeks. Trust became something more. The cabin no longer felt like a lonely man's refuge, but a place with laughter, warmth, and the fragile start of belonging. When Ayanna pressed his hand to her stomach one quiet evening, her eyes shining, Calder's chest filled with a hope he'd long thought buried. A child. Life continuing where hate had tried to end it. They decided to leave before spring, slipping, south across the Rio Grande, where soldiers' papers held no sway. A river valley waited there, with water enough for cattle and soil enough for corn. It would not be easy, but no life worth living ever was. Together they would build something that could outlast the dust and the guns. The prairie winds would carry many stories, of mobs, of soldiers, of vengeance. But somewhere down that river another story began. Of a rancher who defied the world for the girl everyone else left for dead. Of an Apache woman who proved love and survival could root, even in the harshest soil. And of a child who would grow up never knowing the noose, only the strength of two souls who chose each other against every odd. Frontier life was cruel, but sometimes cruelty met its match in stubborn love. Calder and Ayanna's story reminds is that what we choose to protect defines who we are. In a land where vengeance spoke loud, they chose loyalty, family, and hope, and that choice made history. Thanks for riding through this tale with us on Shadow Frontier Tales. If their journey stirred something in you, tap that like button, share it with a friend, and hit subscribe so you don't miss the next ride across the frontier. Wherever you're watching from, may your trail be steady, your fire warm, and your heart unshaken. Until next time, keep the frontier spirit alive.